That was a very nice way of being introduced. So I get to travel a lot. And what do I see? I see amazing people. I see volunteers. So I get to see really incredible volunteers. This is one of them. This picture is in a refugee camp in Burkina Faso. I had the luck to go and visit there to take a look at what the United Nations volunteers were doing there. And Mali, of course, has been in crisis for some time. So the nomadic tribes out of Mali actually migrated and found refuge in Burkina Faso. When they originally arrived there, they were provided by tents, by UNHCR, and other means, food from WFP, a whole collaboration of UN agencies. But the climatological conditions in Burkina Faso are really, really harsh. And after about 6 weeks, the tents started to break down. Holes started to appear. And basically, the community then, as they normally would do, moved out in the area around the camp looking for the normal building materials with which they fixed their tent. But they were so far out of their normal ecological zone that they couldn't find these things. And they were really in a pickle here because they didn't have any money. So they couldn't buy anything to fix the tents. The tents were breaking down and they couldn't source the normal building materials. And that's when volunteers came into action. This United Nations volunteer that you see here, together with 3 volunteers from the Red Cross, sat down with the members of the community in order to discuss how they normally would build a tent and how it was different from the tent that they were currently living in and what they would need. And then together they went to the nearest market in order to see what kind of materials could be found. They built a first prototype that failed. They built a second prototype that failed. They were sitting 6 weeks in this community looking at all the different ways in which this thing could be constructed. And finally, the community said, this is the way that it can be done. And all the building materials were sourced from the local market. They were all new to the nomads who were there from Mali. And it worked. And it worked so well that this is now the standard that is being applied in the entire Sahel region. All the refugees who are arriving in different camps are being now provided with these kind of building materials to build shelters in this exact way. These are 2 midwives. These are 2 midwives from Burkina Faso who I met in Haiti. And that little baby that you see there, they put the little baby in my arms and asked me, when I was holding this little baby, if I actually understood what they were doing in Haiti. And with a little baby in your hands, it's very easy to understand. If you are driven by the desire to help other people, and you actually see that due to a very big earthquake, the entire health infrastructure is breaking down, that you want to go. Because irrespective of what happens in a country, babies are still being born. They don't wait for a natural disaster. They don't wait for an earthquake. They keep coming. These 2 ladies there set up 5 new maternity hospitals with the assistance of UNFPA. At this moment, we are all talking about Ebola. And we did a very simple search. We sent out a notification to the world and say, we need volunteers to go to Ebola. Pretty much in the same way as the government here did in Germany. And we got 500 volunteers to immediately come, ready to go to Ebola territory. In there you have people who are masters in communication and awareness campaigns, who are people who are aware about logistics, cold change, food supplies, and also about 120 medical personnel, 50 qualified doctors, and about 80 to 90 lab technicians, clinical experts, etc. People who are immediately ready to drop whatever it is that they're doing, and obviously they're busy people, to go out there. People from 110 different nationalities. As I speak, I will be clicking to show you. This is basically what is going on at this moment in Ebola. This is in, if I remember correctly, Côte d'Ivoire. Why? Because people need to be made aware that Ebola is coming. And you're not talking about societies here where there actually is a lot of television coverage. People will sometimes listen to the radio, but still important messages are brought from person to person. And you need to have that personal contact if you want to talk about the hygiene measures that you need to take in order to protect yourself against Ebola. Or volunteers working with people in rural areas about the different ecological ways in which they can have a green ecology. Farmers that learn how to protect their own environment better by word of mouth. You will see varied pictures also of youth volunteers. This one is from Jordan. So many volunteers. And who am I? I am the executive coordinator of UNV. And as such, I represent 6,400 of such volunteers who worked all over the world. They came from 182 nationalities. They worked in 132 different countries. They worked for 28 different United Nations agencies. And all of them related directly to people, to human beings. All of them are the front line of development, the front line of the United Nations. I also, by the way, represent a group of nearly 65,000 online volunteers. These are people who have last year jointly conducted nearly 11,000 online volunteering assignments. You don't always need to leave your own country or your own community in order to contribute to international development. You can actually do this from the comfort of your own home. Some people, let's say we recently were in contact with a lady who had multiple sclerosis, would never leave her house again. But online volunteering gave her the opportunity to actually contribute to a school project that was being set up in Kenya. What you may not know is that nearly 40% of the civilian staff of the United Nations peacekeeping operations are volunteers. 30% of the field personnel of UNHCR, the organization that deals with refugee crises around the world, are volunteers. And we currently have the largest refugee crisis ever in the history of the world. We have never had more refugees. We are UNV and we live in Bonn, Stadt der Vereinten Nationen, city of the United Nations, and we are very proud of it. Now, it doesn't surprise you if I were going to tell you that volunteers are very useful people now. But they are. Because at the foundation of nearly every social improvement that has taken place over the last 75 years, you can see that there's an act of unselfish volunteer work. Let me try and see if I can do a bit of an experiment. I can see that actually the average age of the people here, you probably are all parents, or at least the majority of you are parents. Can I ask, how many of you have children who do sports? Just a sign of hands? Okay, hold up your hand, but now take your hand down if the coach or the trainer of your child or your children is a paid professional. You see how many hands remained? Now, I used to be very heavy into swimming and water polo. That was the thing that I did. Between the age of 8 and the age of 25, I spent in a swimming pool. I studied in between, met my wife in between, but that was more or less incidental. It's not true. But I had these incredible coaches. I had these people who taught me about teamwork, about fair play. They taught me about no pain, no gain. They taught me about winning, and they taught me about losing. And losing and getting back into the swimming pool next day to resume your practice. These kind of values that we hold dear in our society are being imparted on your children by volunteers. Not by highly paid and highly skilled educators, but actually by people who volunteer their time and who work with your children. That is how useful volunteers are. Because if you would want to have a sports club in Germany without volunteers, the parents would not be able to simply afford it. So volunteers add value. Basically, volunteers also build the community. They pull people in. They make sure that people are touched upon. Think about those volunteers who visit the elderly at home or who assist with reading in schools. They create a relationship. But how do you measure this? How do you value this? How important is this really? Well, it's interesting that many countries across the world are trying to find out how much volunteering is going on and how much volunteering is worth. In the United States, they calculate that nearly 24.5% of the population volunteers for more than 8 hours a day. In Canada, this is a whopping 47%. In Australia, it is calculated at this moment at 36%. UNDP sponsored some research in Bangladesh, and in Bangladesh, they discovered that in 2011, 16 million people volunteered their own time without any financial compensation for more than 8 hours a day. That is 10% of a population, and Bangladesh is by no means a wealthy country. Similarly, Brazil, a country that really is at this moment lifting itself up, it is at 23%. But what is this worth? Well, in the United States, they calculated that the value of 24.5% of the population volunteering is $162 billion. And they value, through economic modeling, 1 hour of volunteer to basically create a value of $22. So, if you would buy the services of volunteers, you would have to pay $22 an hour. In order to maybe take another take on this, I have to quote something that is in the works. But there's research being done in Tasmania, which is a very nice, colder island off the coast of Australia. And there they came to a staggering conclusion. Every $1 that is being spent on mobilizing a volunteer, supporting a volunteer in their action, helping them to complete their assignment, has a return of $5. Hang on. So $1 of investment in making sure a volunteer can get to do something has a return of $5 to the society. What is this return? The first return is that of human capital. Did you actually know that it's a proven fact that those people who volunteer are healthier and live longer? On that side, I think I'm going to be a very healthy, very old person. But anyway. But also, do you know that volunteers are acquiring knowledge and new skills on a daily basis in their interacting with people, in tackling social problems, and simply doing things that they haven't done before? Volunteers create social capital. I already mentioned that. They build trust in societies. They build networks of contacts with people and connect them. And they are ultimately the embodiment of civic engagement. If you want to change something in the world, change starts with you. Start doing something. Very strong value. And finally, yes, volunteers do build physical capital. There are a lot of volunteers who provide a service. There are a lot of volunteers that produce goods. And actually, volunteers build assets. Here in Germany, the Red Cross has actually built hospitals, initially through volunteer efforts. So, volunteers are actually very important people. One at a time. But if we now take a look at the new global challenges that are facing us, let's take a look at climate change. Let's take a look at the ecological dangers that are facing us and the adaptation. If we can eradicate poverty, can we not start tackling those kind of challenges also one at a time? Because it is about changing human behavior. It is about consuming in a different way. It is about living in a different way. It is about treating energy in a different way. And probably we will need volunteers in order to lead that discussion. It cannot all be done by governments. It cannot all be done by policy. It cannot all be done by investment. Volunteers, therefore, in our opinion, are essential to global well-being. And I quickly want to tell you the story of the Millennium Development Goals. I'm sure you all have heard about them. They were adopted by the United Nations in the year 2000. And what are they about? Very simple. They are about women being able to choose when they have babies, that they can have those babies in safety and with support from medical birth attendants, that those babies can actually have enough to eat in the first 1,000 days so that their brains properly develop, so that they can actually go to a school where they can get a decent education, so that they can become good members of society. And as good members of society, they should be able to eat enough food every day and to have a little bit of money in their pocket to be able to deal with life events. That is the Millennium Development Goals. But when they were formulated originally in 2000, and we in the United Nations, together with our partners, stepped out and said, We think that poverty will be halved by 2015. Everybody said, what is this? You're just coming around here and telling us that poverty is going to be halved? And then we said, it's even worse. We will halve hunger. We do this if we work together. If you have a very clear government policy, government expenditure, and a government direction. If there is a mutual reinforcement between public investment and private investment. In final analysis, poverty has been reduced, by the way, by nearly 50%. We met the target. And private investment had a lot to do with that, because private investment is what generated jobs, what got people employed, what made sure that they had money in their pocket. But private investment could not have worked without public investment. Who is going to construct the roads? Who's going to construct the schools and run the schools so that people get education so that they can actually work somewhere? Public and private investment need to work together. Governments need to set policies. But in final, very, very basically, people have to change their behavior. People have to do something different. I hope you all have heard about this one before, but it's my favorite quote. It's Einstein's definition of insanity. Continue to do the same thing and expect the outcome to be different. And this is it. The world decided to do something different. The world combined decided that really, if we tackle this in a different way, if we work together in a different way, we can do something done. We can get something done. So poverty was halved. HIV/AIDS prevalence was reduced by 44%. Maternal mortality rates were reduced by 45%. We still didn't meet the target of nearly 66%, but we actually reduced it by 45%. This was unprecedented in the world. We actually made up our mind to do something together, and we did it. Not on every indicator, not on every target, not in every country, oh no. Just think about what currently is happening in Central African Republic, or what is currently happening in Syria. Whatever gains there were, of course, by war and by civil strife is basically being undone. But in a very large part of the world, we actually made a difference. And then true to human nature, if you can do something simple, the next time around you want to do something more complicated. And now we are talking about creating sustainable development goals. 17 sustainable development goals with an incredible integrative framework behind that. Human nature always wants to find the next mountain to climb, and now it's called Sustainable Development Goals. Now, if we take a look at this and we say we now are going to be dealing with the urbanization issues, we're going to be dealing with climate change, we're going to be dealing with real ecological issues, and we're going to deal it up front, we're also trying to do this at the end of a global economic crisis, when all countries in the world are facing incredible resource constraints. So how are we going to get this done? Well, in the same way as we did the Millennium Development Goals, with government direction, government focus, public investment, private investment. But we would argue at this moment also with a very strong involvement of people and volunteers, because volunteers are high value but relatively low cost. For $1 invested in every volunteer, you get a return of $5. Why don't we invest in that? Why don't we make sure? So my talk was called Volunteers Opening Soon Near You. And I really do believe that. If we all want to achieve these goals, we all need to go and volunteer. It's not that complicated. You have a computer, you can volunteer. You have feet, you can walk to the nearest sports club and volunteer. But we need to have overall, it's a greater awareness of the opportunities that people have to volunteer. The opportunities that volunteers add to societies. Some societies are very aware. I think the German society is extremely aware. Germany actually has 2 words for volunteer work. Freiwilligenarbeit, which is literally volunteer work, and ehrenamtliche Arbeit, which is work which you do because you gain honor and you give honor to society by doing it. It's actually an important function. Volunteers need to be visible. The issue of volunteerism is not something that has been discussed a lot. Everybody, when I tell the story about playing soccer and football, will immediately understand that volunteers have an enormous value. But if we truly are going to transform the world, how do we really engage? How do we make sure that those volunteers that have something to contribute speak out? How do we make sure that when countries start taking a look at how to implement sustainable development goals, that they also think about those same volunteers. A real change, a real transformation in the world requires volunteers. It requires you to find the volunteer in you. It requires you to recognize the volunteer sitting next to you. And it requires all the volunteers in the world to get behind sustainable development. You will see me talking about this a lot. This is not just a job, it actually is a calling. It is what I do in life. Thank you.